Good morning. My name is Ryan Hass, and I'm the director of the John L. Thornton China Center here at the Brookings Institution. And I want to thank everyone for joining us online on this wintry day in Washington, D.C. for today's discussion. We have an important discussion today. The event is titled Navigating the Uncertainties of U.S.-China Relations Over the Next Decade. We're going to look through this discussion at a couple of key questions. The first, how fixed is the trajectory of U.S.-China relations? How will each country's domestic situation influence the approach that they take to the relationship? And how will external factors impact the way that the two countries approach the relationship? Today's event is a co-hosted project by PAX Sapiens as well as the Brookings Institution. PAX Sapiens, along with the Grandview Institution and Rios partners, have produced a new report on future scenarios for the U.S.-China relationship that will be presented momentarily. In terms of the run of show today, we will begin with a presentation by Betty Sue Flowers and Conor Seyle on the findings of their year-long study, which will be followed by an expert panel that will dig deep into the future trajectories and potential pathways for the U.S.-China relationship. Betty Sue Flowers is a distinguished teaching professor emerita from the University of Texas, as well as the former director of the Johnson Presidential Library. And Conor Seyle is vice president of operations at PAX Sapiens and a senior strategic advisor at One Earth Future. To everyone in our audience, you can join our discussion by submitting questions through X or Twitter at the hashtag USChina or by emailing events@brookings.edu. With that, I would like to turn the microphone over to Conor and Betty Sue. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. And welcome to everyone. I appreciate your attendance in this cold and snowy DC day. I hope the transition to the webinar format didn't disrupt folks' plans. Well, yes, my name is Conor Seyle. I'm the VP of Operations at PAX Sapiens. And what I would like to do is just introduce the study that Ryan mentioned. We launched this study because I'm sure that the participants, that all of you dialing in are dialing in because you are concerned about the U.S.-China bilateral relationship and its enormous influence on the global system. But this relationship is a complex relationship, complex in the technical sense, meaning that it is composed of a lot of different issues interacting with each other and a lot of different competing priorities. It's subject to exogenous shocks, such as the invasion of Ukraine that changed the geopolitical system. It's also subject to a lot of internal pressures within both governments as competing priorities on issues of trade, diplomacy, security interact with each other. Complex systems are extremely challenging to work with. They resist linear theories of change or classic forecasting methods. It's very difficult to say if X, then Y in a complex system. However, what you can do is try to assess the aggregate state of the system and understand what are the trajectories that might be possible. We think that that's useful in the context of U.S.-China so that people working in the area or those just interested in these issues can understand what are some of the ways that the relationship might evolve over time and make decisions that help bring about a future that we prefer rather than one that we don't. So just briefly, the partners on this project were PAX Sapiens, which is our foundation. We work on the prevention of predictable catastrophes, including U.S.-China conflict. Our Chinese partner, the Grandview Institution, which is an independent Beijing-based Chinese think tank, and Rios Partners, which is an organization that works on scenarios specifically with a deep, rich history of using scenarios for planning and understanding events. And I should say just the caveat that, as Betty Sue will introduce, this is the result of a consensus process from a lot of experts on U.S.-China issues. We don't represent that the authors of this report believe or agree with every specific word said here. This is a consensus process, and there is a consensus in the aggregate, but we did want to say that this is a collective project. And with that, I will turn it over to Betty Sue to talk a little bit more about the process that Rios used and that we used for this project.
Conor, next slide. This is what we did. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, well, it's a quick romp through a form of methodology that differs somewhat from what I've experienced when I've worked with government scenarios. And then we'll see this slide again to talk about the opportunities in each of these spaces. So we selected the team, we interviewed the team and additional experts. We met for a week in Thailand to generate the scenario elements, and then we spent months creating the scenarios in a back and forth process through email. Next slide, Conor. Here's how we generally think about the future. People, just everyday, ordinary, anybody, including people in government. There's a past we know, there's a near future we extrapolate from the past, and what we generally do about the future we can't really see is that we continue extrapolating, and there is an unconscious official future that we operate inside of. Next slide, Conor. But as we know, the one thing we do know about the future is that we can't predict it. So some event happens, and then that nice extrapolated line gets bent. Next slide. So what I'm used to in government often is people will build two scenarios. One is sort of reminiscent of the official future, and the other is some kind of alternate future. And I remember Kissinger saying he really didn't like scenarios because his staff would come in and there would be one capitulation scenario and nuclear war scenario, and then in the middle, a third scenario they really wanted him to adopt. So these two futures are often then, next slide, Conor, voted on as which is most plausible. And what happens is very often, the creation of a new official future from which seems most plausible. Next slide. Now, the methodology we used in this project is a little different because it is the creation of plausible futures that are all equally plausible and that in effect vie with the official future by keeping leaders flexibly oriented towards the future. So the question is not which future is likeliest to happen, but how would our strategy, how would it work in each of these futures? What would we do if this were the future? What would our opportunities be if that were the future? So it's important to realize this methodology is not about voting which is most plausible, but what we would do in each of these futures. Next slide. So scenarios are not forecasts, what will happen, although forecasts are very valuable to have in the toolbox. They're not policy recommendations, what should happen. Next slide. They're about what could happen. They have to be relevant, challenging, credible, and clear in order to be useful. And I want to stress useful because that's the point of scenarios, to, I guess you could say, build platforms for useful discussions. It's in the discussions that the real gold of scenarios can be found. Next slide. So let me end by talking about the opportunities here that can be had in each of these. Selecting the team. Every part of the system, if possible, could be represented in the room. And this is particularly important when, for example, we did scenarios for the future of the drugs problem in the Americas, sponsored by the OAS. We had generals, we had former FARC guerrillas. It took a year to negotiate the team. Then next, the opportunities in the interviews to see what themes emerge that we'll have to deal with no matter what. Then we meet to generate scenario elements. At this point, we don't have stories, we have elements like the queen died, then the king died. That's not a story. A story is the queen died, then the king died of grief. How are they connected? And that's what we do in the back and forth iterative process. Next slide, Conor. This is an example of the iterative process. One of the early drafts of the war scenario, at that time it was called armed conflict. You can see the comments along the side that I've recreated there. And then the footnotes are former comments that have formed different discussions back and forth until we finally come to agreement. I think this time it was 17 drafts. Next, Conor. So scenarios provide a common framework and language for searching for answers to questions of strategy and policy. So what opportunities and threats would we face in each scenario? What are our options? What can we do to respond to these opportunities and threats? What could we do now? The point of a scenario dialogue is not to create a new official version of the future, but to become flexibly oriented to the future so that we can meet it with everything we have and all of our understanding of possibilities that come out of a scenario dialogue process. Thank you.
Excellent. And so with that as context, I will give a little bit of information about what came from the scenarios. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the actual narrative structure of the individual scenarios because, as Betty Sue says, these are not forecasts. It's not a question of us saying, okay, this specific chain of events centered around this specific region or incidents is the only way that this could happen. Instead, the narratives that you'll find in the scenarios report represent a way of thinking about an underlying end state or evolution, a plausible narrative. But as far as kind of like the framing of this and this conversation, what we want to do is talk about the conditions. What do these scenarios look like in the abstract without getting into the specific narratives of it? However, the reason that they're written as narratives is that we are storytelling creatures, and it's useful to have a narrative, a story in the way that Betty Sue is talking about. And so I would really encourage you to download the report and read it. So our authors proceeded in this iterative process that Betty Sue described to generate a consensus among a team of U.S. and Chinese experts, including academics, former members of government, and think tank folks. This process generated 4 plausible outcomes for the next 10 years. The first we called drift. In the drift scenario, both countries continue to contest the different national interests and aggressively promote their particular goals and objectives across a variety of different issue spaces. We see continuing contestation around economic issues, in international institutions, on security questions. However, there is no comprehensive break. There is no tipping point that moves too far, largely because of skillfully managed diplomacy, crisis by crisis. So the rhythm of this is one of continuing contestation, but also continuing successful walking back from the brink. To some extent, you can look at this as a status quo, but I would caution against that because one of our authors said that in the Thailand meeting. Somebody commented that this sounded like the status quo, and the author said, no, the conditions that allow this to happen have been attenuated over the past several years. And so in order for this to be the status quo, we would actually have to go back to where we were in the past. The second scenario is war. This is, of course, the shadow that hangs over the relationship. And in our interviews with participants, it was the single most asked question when we asked them what they would want to know if they could see the future. Will there be a general conflict between the U.S. and China? This narrative that we have in our understanding of the war scenario, it is not a case of a single escalatory event or a single crisis that spins out of control. Instead, the war scenario is a scenario of increasing crises leading to increasing distrust in diplomatic solutions, increasing frequency of confrontation in the presence of military forces, and hardening of attitudes on both sides, where for domestic reasons, it becomes increasingly difficult to engage in a diplomatic solution until finally a point is reached at which point there is no diplomatic solution to an escalatory crisis leading to a general conflict. The third scenario we called blocks. In this scenario, the de-risking and decoupling processes that are happening across economic and technical domains, coupled with the fragmentation of international institutions and the creation of new institutions and new systems, continues to the point where we evolve into essentially non-overlapping ecosystems, entirely separate communities with different standards, different institutions, and different systems, with the result being that not only is there very little engagement across the two blocks, there's very little capacity for engagement. And third-party states are essentially forced to choose which ecosystem they are going to operate within. And then finally, the fourth scenario is, for me personally, one of the more interesting ones, because it's the one that I struggle to kind of completely get my head around. We called it networks. Networks is characterized by a continuing process of de-risking or even decoupling between the U.S. and China on the bilateral level, but no associated formation of economic, political, or technical blocs. Essentially, the rest of the world continues to play a mediating role, standing between the two parties, insisting on some degree of common standards, common engagement, and allowing for a more complex and mediated relationship at the bilateral, even while direct bilateral engagement becomes reduced. So, as I said, I'd encourage you to read the report to get more information about specifically how we see these developing or the narratives that are presented. But you can look at these as 4 different scenarios representing different levels of continuing engagement or disengagement across multiple different axes, including the direct relationship, the economy, politics and security, and technology. And then one last thing that we wanted to include in the report. The participants in the workshop, both in the interviews and afterwards in the drafting of the report, felt that it was important to talk about themes that they saw during the conversation. For those of you who have been working on the U.S.-China bilateral, I think that some of these are things which are fairly common, but participants said they really felt it in the process. And so we called out in the reports, what are themes that we saw? Specifically, there were 5. Not necessarily relating to the scenarios themselves, but the process of the engagement and generating the scenarios. And these were, first, deep mutual mistrust. Unfortunately, both parties persistently believe the other is not being fully honest in either formal or informal engagement in ways which challenge forward motion. Differing approaches to engagement, different kind of understandings of what the purpose and goal of formal diplomatic engagement is. Persistent misunderstandings. Both sides reported believing that the other side misunderstood fairly important aspects of domestic politics, decision-makings, priorities, and goals. Of course, the central role of Taiwan. While our scenarios do not posit a specific resolution to the disputes over Taiwan, the fact that it remains a key driver of friction in the relationship came out very clearly in our conversations. And then finally, the role of domestic politics. Both sides acknowledged that both governments have incentives to highlight the other as an opponent in ways which feed into domestic politics and can help address specific government goals in ways which may have ancillary effects on the relationship itself. So thank you very much. I would encourage everyone interested in this to see the website at uschinascenarios.com, where you can see more information about this presentation and through an email link, get a copy of the report itself. Thank you very much for your time. And Ryan, I will turn it back over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Conor. Thank you, Betty Sue, for walking us through both the key findings of the future scenarios as well as the methodology that informed the process. So I similarly encourage people to check out the report if and when they have opportunity to do so. I'm excited now to turn to our panel, which will use that report as a jumping off point for a broader discussion about the future trajectories of the U.S.-China relationship over the next decade. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists one by one, and then we will launch right into a discussion. The first person I will introduce is Patricia Kim, who is my partner in the Brookings China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. She is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and the politics and security of East Asia. Conor, who you just heard from, is in his capacity at PAX Sapiens, oversees the Foundation's grant-making and operating work on Sino-U.S. relations and has co-convened numerous Track 2 dialogues and meetings with U.S. partners and Chinese institutions. Renli Bo is the founder and president of the Grandview Institution. Before founding Grandview, he worked for Xinhua News Agency, where he held various roles, including leading multiple divisions. And last, but certainly not least, Dennis Wilder. Dennis is a friend of longstanding. He's a senior fellow at the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown University. He served in numerous roles in government prior to joining Georgetown, including as the National Security Council Senior Director for East Asian Affairs during the George W. Bush administration, Senior Editor of the President's Daily Brief at the Central Intelligence Agency and as the CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. So we are in good hands in exploring the future of the U.S.-China relationship over the next decade. You may also notice that we have someone else on screen with us at various points. That is Stephanie Lee, who will serve as a consecutive translator for Renli Guo when he participates. So I will begin by asking our panelists a series of questions, and then we will save a portion of time at the end for questions from our audience. We've already received several fantastic questions from members of the audience, so I encourage people to keep it coming. But Conor, I'm going to start with you. You are a political psychologist by training. You look at how organizations can be created to deal with complex and systemic issues. So as you look at other examples, what are other sort of useful examples from the field that you think could inform and help our discussion about the future of U.S.-China relations?
Sure, thank you for that. And this is the point where I need to be cautious because I am not a U.S.-China expert. I sit across our different work, but I am a political psychologist, and we do work on questions of how to address systemic risk. And what I would say in answer to that question is two things. First, I already alluded to it in my opening remarks. Thinking about issues of complex or systemic risk requires trying to engage with specific and discrete issues while understanding that they're part of an embedded system, that there's a lot of different causes and effects operating on them. And the way to do that is to have a loosely held idea of what your end goal is, not a very specific and discrete plan, but an idea of what you are trying to bring about. I think that that's something that in the context of the U.S.-China relationship, there's a conversation to be had about what is possible. But I would caution us against trying to come up with a roadmap which is so specific that we have very discrete and specific check marks, and if one of them goes off, the whole plan is broken. We like to quote Eisenhower a lot, that plans are useless, but thank God for planning. And the other thing I would say is that in our work around disaster risk mitigation, one of the things that I think we see repeatedly is this common refrain that change appears impossible until it happens, and then it looks inevitable. Very often in disaster situations where risk is driven by individual level behavior or choices, you see a resistance to change until the scope of the potential disaster becomes so self-evident that you can often see very rapid behavior change. And there's specific examples in the case of Ebola in West Africa, climate change, and other issues that you can point to. Whether that's relevant to the U.S.-China relationship or not, I think remains to be seen, and whether it's relevant to leader decisions rather than the kind of population level decisions, I also think is a separate question. But I would say that I am personally optimistic about the capacity for complex systems to change in positive ways, even when it looks like that may not be feasible. And so I would say that may be relevant to this. Thank you.
Well, optimism is always welcome. Dennis, I want to turn to you next, because as I mentioned in my introduction of you, you spent your career in the intelligence community and also in senior roles in the policy world. Bring us into how the United States government does this. How does the United States government do futures assessments, and how does it feed into and inform policy discussions?
Oh, thank you, Ryan. And I'm glad to be here with you, even though we're having to do this virtual this morning. Let me just say that since 1947, when we were founded at the CIA, our policymakers, U.S. presidents, not only want insightful futures assessments, they demand it of us. And so we are constantly refining our processes. We're constantly doing lessons learned. And let me tell you the techniques that we have found most successful. First of all, we're not simply looking for potential scenarios, but what we want to do first is identify the key variables that will influence the future trajectory of relations. So if you look at U.S.-China relations, let me list 4 variables that we would look to. The state of the Chinese economy, the cohesion of the Chinese political leadership, the military capabilities and readiness of the PLA, and the strategic vision of Xi Jinping. Now, once we identify those variables, policymakers want us to assess the likelihood of future developments by completing this sentence. The specific actions, inaction, or events that will move one of these variables include what? In other words, tell me what we should be watching to judge the trajectory or course of events. So let's take the question of Chinese military capabilities. What are the specific actions we're looking to evaluate in order to see how this plays into U.S.-China relations? Is China devoting the resources to build the type of military capabilities, such as amphibious landing ships, to take Taiwan? If so, how rapidly? Is China developing a nuclear force and strategy that will support a launch on warning capability rather than today's limited retaliatory capability? How pervasive is the corruption within the Chinese military, and what effect does that have on military readiness? And finally, how is the Ukraine war affecting Chinese military thinking, particularly with regard to the U.S. will and capacity to defend Taiwan? So identifying these specifics is a powerful analytic tool because you can return to them over time and evaluate again and again where they are, which will refresh your assessment of the future. The final step policymakers want in futures analysis is for the analyst to evaluate the consequences of specific U.S. actions, not to recommend policy, but to look at how these events will play into U.S. policy. So let's look today. Will Jake's small yard, high fence strategy have a meaningful impact on military modernization in China? We need to over and over again evaluate that. Will working with our allies in the region meaningfully affect China's calculation on taking Taiwan? Again, we need to evaluate that over time. And will a Ukraine victory in the war with Russia meaningfully affect China's calculation on the Taiwan question? So let me just sum up quickly by noting that the key to good analysis of future trajectories is identifying the right key variables. You get those wrong and your analysis is flawed. Our most famous example, as we all know, is Iraq WMD. We were focused on trying to answer the wrong question. Policymakers asked us, what is the evidence that Saddam has an ongoing WMD program? This question basically assumed that Saddam had a WMD program, and all we needed to do was marshal evidence. We should have pushed back on the policymaker. We should have told them that they were asking the wrong question. And the real question was, how strong is the evidence that Saddam possesses or is developing WMD? Had we done this, we would have conveyed far more the uncertainty of our analysis, and we might have led them to very different policy choices on Iraq. So my bottom line quickly, our mission as sinologists should be to identify the right key variables that will influence the future trajectory of relations. If we do that well, we will perform the service to policymakers who have to make hugely consequential choices on China policy. Stop there.
Thank you, Dennis. That's fascinating. And I really appreciate the way that you laid out the structured thinking that informs the futures analysis process in the United States government.
It is called structured analytic techniques, by the way.
Good. Renly Bois, I want to ask you the next question, which is walk us through how it works in China. You just heard Dennis explain sort of the structured analytic process in the United States. How does futures assessment get developed in China? Who participates in it? And how is this information transmitted to the policymaking community?
好的，谢谢Mr. House，我想最有可能出现的场景还是有限竞争与有限合作并存啊，因为这已经是未来中美关系的一种新常态，我们可能很难再奢望回到过去，那种在政治互信基础上的这种广泛合作，但是大家可能也都不希望朝着更坏的方向去发展。不管是中国的政策制定者，还是中国的政策执行部门，经济部门，包括智囊团，都认为中美关系的新常态已经形成，而且可能会持续很长的一段时间。
Thank you for your question. In my opinion, in the future, selective decoupling and cooperation will be the most probable scenario and will also be the new normal for future Sino-US relations. We don't expect a return to the phase of comprehensive cooperation based on political mutual trust, but no one wants it to be worse either. From policymakers to policy implementers, from the economic sector to think tanks, people have all recognized that this is a new normal and understand that it will continue into the future.
而且我们了解到，美国对华认知的这个调整用了几年的时间，从智库的全面反思开始，进而影响政府和民众，形成了相对统一的这样的一个社会认知。那中国目前对于美国的这个认知的定型，也经历了几年的时间，包括从智库、媒体、政府都参与了这样的一个系统的思考，形成了一个系统化的一个建构。但是坦诚的讲，相比较美国而言，中国对美国的态度还是更显弹性，也就是说，中国依然认为中美关系是世界上最重要的一对对外关系啊，但是对任何有可能改善中美关系的机会，中国政府是抱着比较开放的态度的，而且对未来改善对美关系的各种可能性，比美国而言更显乐观和信心。
We understand that it took a couple of years for the US to adjust its posture towards China. Starting from think tanks, the rest of the society gradually reached a relatively consistent social recognition. The same thing is happening in China. Think tanks, media, and the government have all participated in this process. But to be honest, China recognizes that Sino-US relations is the most important relations in the world, and China's attitude is less set in stone compared to the other way around. China is more open to opportunities and is positive about improving bilateral relations.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. That gives us something to come back to in a moment. I have a follow-up question, but before asking it, I want to turn to Patty. Because Patty, you've spent a lot of time researching and examining Chinese foreign policy. There is a broad-based perception in Washington, D.C. that there has been sort of a rupture or a major sort of shift in Chinese foreign policy orientation over the past decade. What has your research shown? Do you subscribe to that view or not?
Well, Ryan, thanks very much. Let me start by congratulating Conor, Betty Sue, and all of those who contributed to the project on the launch of your report. I think the premise of the project, which is thinking through the potential pathways that the U.S. China relationship may take in the coming years so that Washington and Beijing can better manage their options and better manage the relationship, is very much a laudable objective. I also appreciate the deep thought that went into the methodology of the study. I found the scenario narratives quite interesting, and then the 5 supplementary observations about mutual distrust and differing approaches to engagement and so on. I found all of that quite compelling. If there's just one critical comment, an observation that struck me about the potential scenarios is that there's actually quite a bit of overlap among the 4 scenarios, and many of the phenomena that are described as being unique to one scenario or another are actually at play already today. For instance, I think the U.S. China bilateral relationship in your study is characterized as being defined by either continuous tension or strategic disengagement or uneasy coexistence or hostility. But in reality, I think all of these elements already exist in the relationship, and they're present at heightened or moderate levels, depending on what aspect that we're looking at or what issue set that one is looking at. And in fact, I think this is the case where the U.S.-China relationship has always had these elements: tension, disengagement, coexistence, and even hostility throughout the entire history of our relations from 1949 to the present day. So Ryan, this gets me to your question about sort of what are the drivers of Chinese foreign policy. I think there's also quite a bit of consistency when it comes to the key drivers or objectives of Chinese foreign policy. The first of these has always been advancing what Beijing considers its core interests. That is the CCP's authority and legitimacy at home, its territorial and sovereignty claims, especially on Taiwan, China's continued economic development and prosperity. Another key driver has been a fear of containment and encirclement and a push by Beijing to find partners to help counterbalance against its adversaries and competitors and to help Beijing advance its core interests. And a third and related objective has been Beijing's quest for regional and global leadership, which is, again, very much linked to this drive to have partners on its side. And while I see these sort of these factors as motivating China's foreign policy, I think the implementation of these drivers have varied throughout the different periods, depending on China's domestic situation, the resources that it has on hand, as well as China's external environment. For instance, since the early days of the PRC, I think Beijing has tried to portray itself as a leading voice of the developing world or the post-colonial world. And in more recent years, along with its rise, we're seeing Beijing make a concerted effort to pitch itself as a non-Western great power that's a champion of the global South. We're seeing great efforts to boost non-Western groupings like the BRICS and the SCO, all while at the same time pushing the narrative that Washington, in a bid to preserve its dominance, is holding back the developing countries of the world from reaching their full potential. And so there's very much a competitive aspect to China's drive for regional and global leadership, although I think the intensity of the competitiveness and the sort of the character has varied throughout history based on China's capacities and its perceptions of the broader environment. But let me leave it there, Ryan, and turn it back to you.
Good, thank you. Before we move on, Patty had some reflections on the report. I want to give Conor and Renly-Bo a chance if they want to offer any reactions.
Well, just briefly, I think you're exactly right. And what's interesting to me about these scenarios is that I'm a social scientist by training, and I almost look at it as a multi-axis issue. There are the different elements of hostility, engagement, decoupling that you mentioned. And then there's also multiple axes on which these different kind of orientations or engagements play out across technological, economic, diplomatic. And so to some extent, these scenarios are a way. Adam Kahane, the author of the scenarios method, likes to say that these scenarios are ways of seeing the present rather than necessarily ways of thinking about the future. And I think that's the case here. I think that these scenarios are predicated on the dynamics that are happening today. I think that that's valuable because one of the things we did with our authors was press, okay, what might change? And the answer was these dynamics appear to be pretty strong. So the question essentially becomes, across the different domains of contestation, how far does the tension go in each of these different areas? How do these areas correlate? Where are the opportunities for cooperation, and where might there be breaches? And in the aggregate, those processes then create the potential end states. So I agree with you 100%. It's very interesting to me that from one perspective, there's not an enormous amount of difference between the different scenarios. There's some very conspicuous missing scenarios, which I think we'll talk about here momentarily. So I agree with you. Libo?
我想补充的是，确确实实经过这个几年的调整哈，尤其是中方已经确认了这样一个事实，中美关系进入到一个新的常态。这个新常态的这个特征里头，中美之间的矛盾会不断的呈现出来，但是，这些不断呈现其实就是一个相对稳定的状态啊。那么在这样一个相对稳定的状态当中，我们要接受不稳定的因素不停的出现啊，这是目前中国对中美关系目前的一个基本的定义和一种新的适应状态。
Yes, after years of changes and adjustments, we have realized that the Sino-US relations is entering this new normal where there will be more conflicts. But as conflicts show themselves, the entire relation is more and more stable. So we are navigating those instabilities in a relatively stable situation. And this is a new normal that we're seeing.
Good. Well, thank you, Dennis. I'd like to turn back to you because, you know, a lot of our thinking about whether or not the relationship is locked on a fixed trajectory or if there's a variable trajectories available to it depends upon our assessment of the national course that each country is going to follow. And my question to you is, how fixed is China's national course right now? Is it possible that China could course correct on major issues in the future, perhaps under a new leadership?
Thanks, Ryan. Before I answer that, let me give one thought on the study that was done. And I'm sure Conor and Li Bo do not want new homework, but we have another structured analytic technique that they might use to advance this study. And we call it alternate futures analysis. In essence, what you do with this technique is take the end state, say the end state of war, that is one of the scenarios, and you ask for your analysts or your policy, people who you're working with, to create a scenario, to create the narrative on how the U.S. and China got to that end state, starting from the present. So what were the key points of decision making on both sides? What were the key endogenous and exogenous variables that led to that end state? This is an exercise in creative writing. It can be very difficult to do. Very few people do it well, but it's a very powerful tool for policymakers if it's done well. So I just leave that on the table. On the question of China's positions, first of all, no, everything is not decided. I think there are three immutables in China's future. One, the goal of national reunification. No matter who is the leader, what the political system is, the goal of national reunification will be the key goal of China. Secondly, eventual reunification with Taiwan. I don't think there's any question, again, depending on leadership, political system, this will always be a goal. And thirdly, of course, the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, below that, though, things can be very different. And I think we get ourselves locked into the idea that somehow Xi Jinping is forever, or Xi Jinping policy is forever. And what we forget is how many different iterations of Chinese policy there have been. Deng Xiaoping was a surprise when he came back for the third or fourth time, I can't remember. Nobody thought that's what would happen in China at that moment. Xi Jinping was a surprise. We thought he was a reformer. He turned out to be a very different kind of leader. So the idea that China is on a set trajectory just historically makes no sense. A new leader of China, a different leader of China, could take China on a very different course. He could go back to the Deng Xiaoping reform philosophy. I think the leader will still be communist. I think the leader of China will still not have democratic values and will uphold party values. But as we have seen, you can uphold party values in very, very different ways depending on the Chinese leader.
Thank you. Ridley Bo, I'd like to ask a similar question to you. What is the perception in Beijing? Is the perception that America is locked on a fixed course and has a set path that it is going to follow, particularly in its relationship with China? Or is there allowance of the possibility that future leaders could adjust America's approach in different directions going forward?
OK，我个人的观察这个美国对中国的这种整体的情绪， 或者判断。第一个是一种对中国国力提升之后，进而引发这个全球影响力，从国力提升到全球影响力提升，美国会担心，这种国力和影响力的提升会破坏美国对全球秩序的构建基础和这种控制能力。同时可能美国也更多强调，中国外交这2年的一些变化，包括国防自卫能力的这种建设所表现出来的张力，会威胁到美国的这样的一个全球利益。这使得这个美国包括其他的一些国家可能会认为，就世界秩序的不确定性正在增加。
From my own personal observation, first, America is anxious over a stronger China's increasing global influence, worried that this might disrupt the global order that's been constructed and controlled by the U.S. And second, for the U.S. and some other countries, the tenacity demonstrated by China's foreign policy and its national defense capacity seems to add uncertainties to the current world order as it challenges U.S. global interest.
我们在中国人的这个看法里头哈，就美国把这个世界看成了一个零和博弈的这样一个利益场，这个限制了美国对很多重大问题的一些看法。那么回应刚才 Dennis 讲到的，就是中国的领导人通过一系列的努力，未来有没有可能能够改变或者说去改善一下这个美国现在对华的这些态度呢？我认为是有可能的。因为我不知道你们注意到没有，中国最近召开了一次这个中央外事工作会议，这些信息、这个文件当中和这个讨论当中所呈现出来的一个重要的信息，就是中国的外交未来可能会变得更加的开放性平衡性，包括展示出更多的多元性。那么这种调整有可能会让这个中美之间彼此能发现更多的这个共同利益，开展更多的这个共同行动。另一方面，大家也看到，中国现在在跟欧洲单向度的在表现出很多的这种友好，反过来也可能会推动美国对一些问题的重新认识进而去反思现状调整政策，这应该是相互的。
China believes that America views the world as a zero-sum game when it comes to national interest, and thus limiting the thoughts on many issues. And back to your question on whether there is going to be changes in the future, I believe so. The recent Central Conference on work relating to foreign affairs was held in Beijing, and it conveyed the message that China's foreign policy will be more balanced, open, and inclusive. This adjustment allows us to discover more mutual interests and open up more doors for cooperation. On the other hand, China is also seeking cooperation and collaboration with other countries in the world, for example, the European Union. And we believe that those connections and collaboration will indirectly contribute to a better Sino-US relations.
我想补充一点，针对刚才这个Patrick Kim 谈到的中国外交可能做出的一些变化，其实坦诚的讲，前几年中国的外交在应对国际压力面前，它是有一定的被动性的一些反应的。但这次中央外事工作会议召开完之后，中国外交其实更多呈现出了一些主动性的调整，就是我刚才提到的平衡性、开放性。我希望大家能够关注到这些微妙的变化，以及这些微妙的变化未来在行动层面所体现出来的效果。
And also, for your question, Kim, I feel like we should understand that there are changes in our foreign policies. In the past couple of years, under the international pressure, we are more on the passive side of actions. But in recent years, especially after the Central Conference, we should realize that our actions are going to be more active. We're going to actively change our focus to a more balanced and open policy. And we are looking forward to see how that will actually end up in actions.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate you bringing your perspective to this conversation. Patty, I want to turn to you, both to give you a chance to respond to Libo's comments, but also to ask, I think that that Brinley Boyle and Dennis both agreed that that the U.S.-China relationship and each country's national direction is not preset or locked. If that is the case, then what factors will have the most direct bearing upon the direction that both countries take and the relationship travels going forward?
So Ryan, I broadly agree that the U.S.-China relationship, the trajectory is certainly not fixed, or there isn't one trajectory. But I do think that barring some dramatic change in the domestic situation of either country, the relationship will be largely defined by competition over the next decade. And I think it's quite natural for the U.S. and China, as the world's two largest economies, top military spenders, leading innovators, and great powers that seek influence and leadership on the global stage, to be in a vigorous competition for the foreseeable future. But again, I don't believe that the nature and the parameters of this competition are fixed. I think it is possible that we could find ourselves descending into an increasingly debilitating rivalry on the one hand, or to strive for a more constructive coexistence on the other. And I think, Conor, this is sort of what's shown in the scenarios that you all present in the report. But again, I don't think the trajectory is predetermined, and it really will depend on the political will and the efforts on both sides. Although, again, structurally speaking, I think there's some level of competition that will always remain. Now, a key question I think that both sides are grappling with today is whether one side or the other poses an existential threat to the other. And I think while China poses a significant challenge on a wide array of issues for the United States, my view is that it doesn't pose an existential threat to the U.S. homeland, and neither does the U.S. pose an existential threat to China. I do think that both sides have faith in the superiority of their respective systems. Both believe that history will ultimately prove their convictions. But again, this isn't an existential threat yet. And I think there's a recognition that a measured relationship that has elements of both competition and cooperation is in the U.S. and China's respective national interests, although we've struggled to get to that kind of equilibrium in the relationship. Among a number of factors that can impact how the competition ultimately pans out, I think mutual perceptions and mutual trust or lack thereof will have a significant impact on the trajectory of this relationship. For instance, I think many in Washington and Beijing are very relieved that the Biden-Xi summit was successful last November, that the two militaries are talking, that the relationship is relatively stabilized compared to where it was early last year or the previous year. But this stabilization is very fragile. And I think this has to do with the fact that while, again, everybody wants stabilization, at the end of the day, in China, there's a deeply entrenched view across the Chinese public that the United States, in its bid to preserve what they say global hegemony, is depriving China of its right to develop. There's a view that no amount of reassurance from Chinese leaders or a change in U.S. administrations will shift Washington's basic direction. And just as Chinese views of the United States are very dark, I think negative perceptions of China are at historic highs among Americans as well. And so if you look at polling conducted by the Chicago Council or Pew, they always find that a majority of Americans see China in a negative light. They believe that China's development as a world power is a vital threat to U.S. national security interests. There's entrenched views here in the U.S. that China's economic practices are predatory, that its great power ambitions are not benign, and pose a threat to U.S. security and interests. And so I think given sort of the baseline of the views that we see in both countries, it's quite possible that if and when we have another crisis, whether it's something like a surprise, like the spy balloon crisis, or if we have escalation in the usual hotspot, whether it's Taiwan or in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, this could spark a crisis that neither leader can easily de-escalate, given the severe mistrust that we have and the domestic political pressure for leaders to look strong vis-a-vis the other side. And what worries me is that at that point, I think it's going to be very challenging, even if we're able to walk away without a major conflict, for any leader in the US or China to to advocate for restabilizing the relationship after a number of recent failed attempts. And I think that would put the U.S.-China relationship on a very dangerous trajectory.
Thank you, Patty. Conor, in your presentation of the scenarios, you listed 4. They were drift, blocks, war, and networks. How did you settle on 4? And were there others that came close to making the cut?
Sure. Well, for the question of how we settled on 4, that gets back to Betty Sue's presentation about how we think about scenarios and their use. As a set, they need to be useful. And so to some extent, there's a certain amount of just what constitutes a useful range of scenarios. And that is explicitly part of the consideration. We could easily have come up with a dozen. As Patty said, to some extent, there's a lot of similarity. So if we had a dozen, there would be a dozen fairly similar ones. But at the same time, that's just too much as far as kind of like orienting yourself in time, thinking about the future. So the starting point was specifically to develop a set of scenarios that had the breadth to allow alternative conceptions of plausible futures without getting so broad that they become attempts to kind of parse out very narrowly defined if-then statements. The process we used to generate them was a pretty classic qualitative methods process of generating themes, generating clusters of themes collectively as a group, generating and then seeing what are the natural breakpoints between these. I don't think there's anything magic about 4. We did talk about, adding additional scenarios, and I'll come back to that question in a second. But what we settled on was with the understanding that we wanted around 3 to 6-ish. These were the clean 4 that represented the plausible scenarios that our authors saw. Now, the question of what's missing is a really interesting one, because there is a very conspicuous dog that did not bark, and that is, what about a more positive cooperative future? What about a scenario of collaborative, cooperative co-development? As this panel presentation has highlighted, right now, the authors in our project did not see that as a plausible future. We did discuss it. It was obviously something that many people wanted to see as a plausible future. But the authors, and I will say that I think that there were perhaps more people on the Chinese side that saw this as possible than the Americans, not to violate the kind of process confidentiality too much, but just to say that there was certainly a consensus among a strong chunk of the participants that the nature of the relationship is competitive and will be for the next 10 years. And to include something which did not have that as the foundation would be giving in to kind of just so, or just kind of highlighting what we wanted to be true. Is that true or not? I think that we'll see as a global society, but that is certainly the consensus of our authors. And if you're wondering why there's not a more positive cooperative scenario, it's because that was the perspective of the people in the room, that to include that at this stage of the relationship would not be being honest about the nature of the tensions, the nature of the current status of the relationship.
Thank you. You addressed several questions that we've already received from members of our global audience, which was, why wasn't a potential scenario a more positive one about cooperative coexistence? So thank you for sharing that insight and bringing us into the room of those discussions. Dennis, allowing everything that has been said and recognizing that the United States alone does not choose the U.S.-China relationship that exists, if we could suspend disbelief for just one moment and just ask, what would be maximally interest maximizing for the United States? What would be the best type of arrangement or relationship that would serve American interest if it was ours to decide?
Okay, thanks. And now I take off my intelligence hat and put on my policy hat. First of all, I have 4 pillars of this American policy. And I'm going to borrow a term that Dawei has used in an article, which he called uncomfortable coexistence. That is embedded in my 4 pillars. Number one, the United States hedges against a belligerent China. We continue to build the alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. We make Taiwan a credible porcupine that China cannot conquer. We continue to encourage U.S. and allied businesses to diversify their supply chains so we're not overly dependent on China. Two, we have a Taiwan policy that does not include continuing to salami slice our one China policy. There is such a thing as loving Taiwan too much. I think we are in danger of that, and we're in danger of alarming Beijing into foolish actions. So, for example, I think it was very foolish to make the decision to put U.S. military trainers on the ground in Taiwan. We can provide training to Taiwan. We have for decades in the United States, at National Guard facilities, at Luke Air Force Base for the fighter pilots. We don't need to be on the ground in Taiwan. Third, we have to protect the emerging high tech from Chinese from Chinese theft. The small yard high fences is sound policy, but the truth is the way the Chinese get our technology is because our defense industries are incredibly sloppy about security. Over and over again, the Chinese, through cyber, through other means, through intelligence operatives, have stolen key American technology. Just look at their fighter aircraft and you can see American aircraft. They stole the plans for the Trident nuclear warhead. All of these things shouldn't have happened if American industry had a much better security sense when it comes to China. Finally, we must cooperate where we can and where it's in our best interest. There are plenty of areas begging for this kind of U.S.-China cooperation. Cancer and other public health research, we together will do much better than we separately. Jointly assisting the downtrodden in the global south, which is in both of our interests because their problems will only grow, aggravate the world situation, create new crises that we will all have to deal with. And finally, obviously, climate change, just to name a few. So those are my 4 pillars.
Thank you, Dennis. Really, Bo, similar question for you, but from a Chinese perspective. If it was up to China alone to decide the nature of the U.S.-China relationship, how do you think that they would view it in an interest-maximizing way?
OK，在回答您的问题之前啊，我想先回应一下刚才 Conor，以及这个哈斯谈到的，有听众问为什么会有没有更好的一个场景出现？事实上，其实在泰国的时候，我们编辑小组包括很多中国专家，甚至包括一些美国专家都提出了一个更好的场景的一种预设可能性，但是在后续的这个讨论当中，大家最后认为它不应该成为一个共同的这个意见写入到我们的报告当中。但在这个过程当中，其实我想表达的是，其实中方的专家，包括事实上证明，中国在对改善中美关系这件事情上面，意愿确实比美国政府要更强烈一些，尤其是体现在中国的民意当中。
Before I answer your question, I first would like to respond to Conor and some of the questions that our audience raised about why we're not having a more positive scenario. Actually, when we're discussing the report in Thailand, some Chinese scholars, U.S. scholars, and a lot of the authors actually raised a more positive possibility and scenario, but we didn't end up putting it in the book after all the discussion. Now we're seeing the fact that the willingness to build a better bilateral relation is actually higher in China, especially among Chinese citizens.
然后我回答这个 Has 的这个问题哈，就是对于中国利益最大化而言，什么样的中美关系才是最好的？我觉得它可能要符合4个特征，分别对应政治、经济、军事，和这个人文4个方面。我想第一个应该就是重建这个政治互信，加上这个尽量减少误解。第2个特征是广泛的经济合作，加上明确 负面清单。第3个是持续的军事交流，但是要加上提高军备的透明度。第4个是持续的人文交流，加上一点很重要的，就不因冲突和各种突发事件而轻易的去阻断这种人文交流。
Now to your question, what kind of relationship do we want if we maximize the benefits to China? I believe there are 4 different what aspects of the First, we can have more extensive political mutual trust and reduce misunderstandings as much as possible. And second, have extensive economic cooperation with a very clarified negative list. And third, we need to have continuous military exchange and an increased armament transparency. And fourth, we need to continue our person-to-person, people-to-people exchanges that will not be interrupted by conflicts or other unexpected events.
我们可以看到就是在前几年的这个中美关系进程当中，因为很多次这个两边都互相关闭了这个人文交流的这个通道，可能美国朋友认为是中国主动更多一点我觉得未来这个两国政府之间应该达成一种默契就是在中美关系的这样一个新常态下面，不管面临灰犀牛的事件也好，还是黑天鹅的事件，这种种突发事件，我们都应该坚持一点，不能中断人文交流。去年9月份的时候，美国的驻华大使Burns 访问这个国关智库的时候，他提到了一个非常有意思的观点，他认为中美的人文交流也是中美关系的压舱石，我特别同意他这个观点。
In recent years, we've seen multiple episodes where people-to-people exchanges were being cut off because of due to conflicts and other unexpected events. In China, we call those small chance events, that could greatly affect our bilateral relationship as black swan events. I think for both governments, we should commit to the fact that even if there are black swan events or those unexpected incidents, people-to-people exchanges should never be cut off. Last year in September, Ambassador Burns actually visited Grandview, and he mentioned that people-to-people exchanges is also the foundation of our bilateral relationship, and I very much agree to that.
我刚才提到的4点当中，我认为最难做到的，或者说几乎没有可能做到的是第1点，但是我认为我们可以通过努力去实现成功的是第4点，是最有可能的。第2和第3点，我认为还是有一定可能性的。
For the 4 points that I just mentioned, the first one is the most difficult to achieve, but the rest is not beyond our reach, especially the 4th point. And the 2nd and the 3rd point can definitely be improved upon our current status quo.
Well, thank you. Patty, I think it's a truism that neither side controls the U.S.-China relationship. It's a dynamic relationship that is reactive to events in both directions. But the relationship also does not exist in a vacuum. It is impacted and affected by external events. So as you sort of look out over the next decade, what types of major events or trends do you think we need to be most mindful of that could have spillover effect into the way the U.S.-China relationship develops?
Well, Ryan, I think there are a number of external factors or events that are actually already and could further impact the relationship. In terms of regional hotspots of concern, Taiwan, of course, has been a long-standing flashpoint. There's also the Korean Peninsula, where U.S. and Chinese troops actually fought against each other in the first hot war of the Cold War, and where North Korea today is continuing to build its nuclear arsenal and engage in missile tests. And really has been ramping up its aggressive rhetoric over the last few weeks. Actually, there was breaking news this morning that it tested an underwater nuclear drone. And so there's a lot going on there that we need to be watching. There are also concerns about China and Russia's partnership and the implications that this has for the war in Ukraine. There's the potential for escalation in the South China Sea, where tensions have been mounting between China and the Philippines, and so many more areas that could erupt. Now, among these, I think the trickiest is Taiwan, for the reasons that Dennis and others have laid out. Sort of, it's this core interest of China's. It's probably not going to change this desire for unification. I think there's a broad recognition that the military balance in the Taiwan Strait has shifted in China's favor in recent years, and Beijing's increasing use of coercion vis-a-vis Taiwan has really raised questions about what more the US and its allies can do to ensure that Taiwan's future is not determined through coercion. And I think what's most concerning is that there's growing impatience and frustration on all sides. There's great pressure on US leaders, on leaders in Taiwan to take higher and higher profile steps to counter Beijing's intensifying aggression across the military, economic, diplomatic domains towards Taiwan. In Beijing, there's a strong belief that Taiwan is moving further away from unification towards independence, and that it's the United States that's emboldening Taiwanese leaders and societies to move in such a direction. And so there's this determination to forcefully counter these developments. And so in essence, all sides believe that the other is changing the status quo. And while no one wants to go to war over Taiwan, what's concerning is that I think all sides believe that the onus is on the other to reverse course. Of course, the Taiwanese elections successfully concluded last week with the election of Vice President William Lai of the DPP. He's promised to preserve the cross-strait status quo. He's indicated a willingness to open communications with Beijing. And so I think all eyes are now on Beijing, on how it will respond. I think we have to be realistic. Beijing has already discredited Lai as a separatist, as a troublemaker. And so I think it's going to be likely that it will feel the need to react to Lai's speeches, his policies, and his diplomatic activities in a strong way. And so Taiwan is certainly a long-standing area of difference that the US and China will need to very carefully manage. When it comes to hotspots where Chinese territorial claims are not concerned, I think there's actually quite a bit of overlap and theoretically more room for US-China coordination. Whether, again, we're talking about instability in the Korean Peninsula, the war in Ukraine, or the Israel-Hamas war and escalation that we're seeing in the Middle East. I don't think the US and China see eye to eye on any of these crises. We have different positions, but nevertheless, we also share broad interests in maintaining global stability and preventing proliferation. I think it's unfortunate today that we're seeing more finger pointing rather than coordination. Beijing in particular seems reluctant to work with Washington. It seems to be more interested in protecting its relationships with Pyongyang and Moscow and others, rather than using its influence in a constructive way and in parallel with the US. And I think this is highly irresponsible and unfortunate because these external conflicts, these external factors could become a drag on the US-China relationship rather than an opportunity for visibly demonstrating to the American and Chinese publics and to the rest of the world that a stable, productive relationship between the US and China could actually be good for everyone involved. And so I think these external factors, we can look at them as risks, but they are also potential opportunities for the US-China relationship.
Thank you. Conor, I have one final question for you, and then I'm going to ask a question, a lightning round question to the audience before we open this up to the questions from our global audience. The question, Conor, for you is, before COVID, there was sort of this expectation among many in the China watching world that if there was a humanity-threatening event, like an imminent meteor strike, that the United States and China would be capable of sort of setting down their swords and working in common cause for common interest. I think that confidence has waned in the wake of the COVID experience and our inability to come together in common purpose. What's your view? Do you think that it is still possible for the United States and China to do this if there is a future event? And if so, what kind of event would sort of jolt us into that sense of shared purpose?
Yeah, I think this gets back to one of the things that I think we've observed in other crises moments. I will say that I don't want to speak too authoritatively about the decision-making processes of either the US or Chinese government as this relates to this. One of our participants said in the interviews, the thing about DC is that everybody's a China expert and has been for 6 months. And while I really appreciate this process and the chance to work with everybody, I'm doing my best to represent the aggregate perspective rather than my own opinion. Having said that, I asked one of our participants exactly that question in Thailand. And he said, well, sure, of course, but it would have to be an alien invasion. The idea of The perspective I heard from our participants in Thailand was that the core security issues generating competition are so close to both governments that to put them aside in favor of cooperation would require a truly seismic event. I will say part of our work is on pandemic prevention, and I do think that COVID is maybe not a great example of what future cooperation might look like. There were a lot of complexities about that because it arose in China in ways which immediately triggered the more bilateral kind of competition and sense of accusation. I do suspect, honestly, that if it had arisen in a third country, I think we would have seen more active cooperation. The U.S. and China have historically cooperated fairly well on public health issues. And I also think, like I said, what we've seen from other crises is when things get bad enough, humans do change our behavior. So I do think that if there was a crisis which was of significant gravity and importantly, quickly moving enough that it was obvious that decisions needed to be made immediately that required cooperation, I am optimistic that we would see it. I really hope that that is not put to the test, though, because I also think there's a decent chance that the decision-making processes on both sides are firm fixed, and I would rather not bet humanity on requiring that cooperation. However, if you ask me if I was optimistic about it, I would say, yeah, on the basis of prior evidence and other contexts, I do think it would happen. It'd have to be something that was fast-moving and significant, though. Thanks.
All right. Well, it's been a long time, I think, since the Brookings stage has welcomed a discussion about alien invasions, but here we are today in this context. Now, speaking of which, I want to put you all in a time machine. I want to bring you forward to 2034. We're meeting 10 years from today. We're having a discussion about what we got wrong and what we got right. What do you think the relationship is going to look like 10 years from now? I'm just going to ask each of you in a sentence or two to answer this. But what do you think the relationship will look like 10 years from now? Is it going to be more or less confrontational or resemble the current relationship or vary significantly from it? Ridley Boyle, let's start with you. Then we'll go to Conor. Then we'll go to Dennis, and then we'll go to Patty.
OK，我觉得10年以后，跟现在会有一些不同。一个显著的特点是中美之间的矛盾和冲突可能会更多。但是呢，我比较乐观的是，当中美关系进入到一种新常态之后，两国对于危机管理意识的建立也好，包括危机管控机制的这个加强也好，会让中美之间用更理性的心态去面对矛盾和冲突。在这样的场景下面，我觉得很多矛盾和冲突是可以被管控的。
In 10 years' time, I believe there is going to be differences. First of all, there's definitely going to be more conflicts, but I'm more positive because I believe that our crisis management mechanism will also be improved after entering this new normal. And thus, in face of possible conflicts, both countries will have a healthier and more rational mentality, and will be able to keep those tensions and conflicts within control.
我想补充一个重要的信息，就是其实危机管控的这个研究在中国已经持续了20多年，但是危机管控这个词很少出现在国家相关的文件和国防文件当中，极少。但是这几年中国政府包括相关的这个军方对于危机管控的研究越来越深入，慢慢开始进行到实践这个层面，所以这些方面也体现出来中国政府对于美苏之前在冷战期间这种危机管控机制的这种认可，同时也认为现在管控这个中美之间的这个矛盾必须要强化这个危机管控机制。所以我认为未来也许矛盾更多，但是我们的防火墙也会建得更加的坚实一些。
Another information I want to add. The topic of crisis management mechanism has been going on for more than 2 decades in China. We rarely see those words appearing in any official papers or any officially released documents. But in recent years, there has been more research and talk on this topic, not only in the government, but also in the army. And there are more and more extensive research on the same crisis management mechanism during the Cold War period. And thus, more research is happening on this aspect.
Thank you. Conor?
It's an excellent question. In thinking about it, my first answer is I think there is a real risk of a war that nobody wants. And I think that we have to acknowledge that because I think it is imperative that it is avoided. I think the world that emerges in 10 years on the other side of that is not good for the US or for China. So that's a floor. I think that we have to acknowledge that there's a real chance of that. And I think it can be avoided. I certainly hope it will because we really have to. So assuming that we avoid that, to me, I think the world looks something like our network scenario, because one limitation of this project is that we got a bunch of US and Chinese folks and asked them about the state of the world. And the answer is, well, the US and China will determine the world as a whole. I think third countries get a vote. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of pressure to create the kind of complex world that that scenario says. So I would expect de-risking, perhaps extending beyond the initial kind of conception of high walls and small or high walls and small gardens. But I would also expect a strong centralizing force coming from third parties that don't want to be forced to choose. And so my prediction is something that ends up looking something like, whether you call it, networks, multiplex, fragmentation, something like that, because at the end of the day, third countries get a vote too.
Dennis?
I think it will be less confrontational. I don't think we're going to have a war. I think both sides will settle into understanding the kind of strategic competition between these two great powers that will set the course of world history. I think the Chinese will understand some of the strategic mistakes they've been making recently, such as scaring the hell out of their neighbors and aligning with Russia and North Korea. And so I'm optimistic that actually we see our way through to a better day.
Patty?
Well, Dennis, I hope you're right. And Conor and Libo all brought up great points. I agree. I think essentially the relationship will remain competitive, hopefully for the better. And I think this will depend on the leadership, right? How leaders are able to manage this relationship, whether leaders in Beijing and Washington will act as statesmen over this critical decade rather than politicians to ensure that we're at a more stable place.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn now to some questions from the audience. And in the process, Renly Bo, I see your hands up. You're welcome to weigh in with your response. But the first question that we received is from Yosaf Mukherjee from Cardan University, who asked, does the United States seek a direct military confrontation with China over the next decade? And perhaps we can ask Renly Bo to provide his perspective. The second question, I'll just put two questions on the table. The second question goes to Dennis, which is, in a world of variables, how do we have high confidence that we are selecting the right ones for evaluating the structured analytic assessments that you described? So, Renly Bo, over to you.
Sorry,
Can you please repeat the first question?
Yes.
Sure.
Sorry.
Well, I want to give you a chance to, you had your hand up, so I want to give you a chance to say what you wanted to say. But the question was also, do you think the United States seeks a direct military confrontation with China?
Uh, 我想说两个想法啊，我觉得现在中美关系发展到现在，我觉得我们急于要寻找一个在共同的安全利益方向能够进行合作的一个案例。我很同意 Dennis Wilder 先生的这个看法，就是目前朝鲜半岛其实已经进入到一个非常危险的状态。是否会面临战争，包括无核化受到挑战？我觉得在这方面，中国和美国之间，包括中国和日本和韩国之间，都有一些共同利益。这方面我们是不是可以来做一些合作，来避免这个战争？第二个回答还是刚才。
As our relationship has evolved over the years, it is an urgent need to find a common place for cooperation in terms of national security. I very much agree with Dennis. I believe that there are places for cooperation. For example, if we look at the Korean Peninsula right now, it's actually entered a relatively dangerous situation right now. And there are a lot of challenges, including non-proliferation. And in that sense, China and US, China and Japan, China and Korea, we all have some common interests in there and should be seeking cooperation.
第二个，您问这个中美之间未来会不会发生战争？我认为，不会啊，因为中国从政府也好，到民意也好，非常坚定的认为，一场战争，尤其是中美之间的战争，足以阻断中国持续了40多年的这样一个发展历程，中国承受不起这样的这个历史代价，老百姓也不愿意看到这样的结果。所以，中国现在的政策调整也好，政策设计也好，都是在朝着一个避免战争的方向去前进的，包括台湾问题，包括南海问题啊，包括我刚才提到的这个半岛问题。
And to answer your question, I don't believe that we are destined for a war. No matter if it's a government or Chinese people, no one wants to see a war. And we realize that if there is a war going on between US and China, it will push back 40 years of development that China has done in the past. And no one can take it. Chinese citizens don't want it. All of our policies are designed in a way to avoid war at this moment. And that's why our policies orienting Taiwan and South China Sea, and as well as Korean Peninsula are all holding that policy.
Not 4 years, 40 years.
40
Sorry.
years.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dennis?
The U.S. does not want a war. And I think what we have to remember about war in this particular context, if there is a war between China and the United States, it would be the first time that two nuclear powers went to war. The danger in that situation of destroying each other's countries is so high that really war between China and the United States should be inconceivable on both sides. And so I cannot believe any responsible person in the United States wants that war because of the risk involved in it. And certainly I believe the same thing on the Chinese side.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to be very judicious here, but we have a question that I'm going to pose to Conor and one to Patty. The question to Conor comes from Sabine Jean-Francois Arnaud, who's a world editor of the French magazine Challenges. She asked, what role can Europe play in this U.S. China competition? And the question to Patty comes from Robert Manning, who's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, who asked whether a viable framework for the U.S. China relationship can be established absent changes in both the United States and Chinese domestic politics. So Conor, Patty, final word to you.
Sure, just briefly, this gets back to my point about to some extent there may be a tendency to see the bilateral relationship too narrowly as solely a bilateral relationship. And of course, the world as a whole is part of this. I think that Europe has several important roles in the relationship, acting as a potential intensifier or mediator of the competition. I think it can be an intensifier if it leans in and takes a side. I think it can be a mediator if it tries to resist the formation of blocks. I think at the end of the day, the challenge that I see around the U.S.-China relationship, the reason that our foundation has centered it as an issue is that cooperation is going to dramatically facilitate global systems' ability to respond effectively to global challenges. But the converse works as well. Global systems are one of the domains in which the competition plays out. They're also systems in which many other actors have a voice. And I do think that there's a significant role for third countries, and especially European countries, in deciding whether we end up in a future which looks more polarized, more like a bloc's Cold War world, or one which is a little bit more complexly networked. I think that you'd have to be more expert than I am to get into the details of exactly what that should look like with trade policy and electric vehicles and all the specific issues where Europe is playing a key role in deciding where things go. But I think getting back to the idea of loosely holding aggregate outcomes, I certainly hope that Europe plays a constructive role in preventing the formation of this kind of Cold War blocks. And I think that they certainly can. Thanks.
Well, thank you to Bob for that good question. Since we have 1 minute left, I'll just say briefly that I think public opinion when it comes to foreign policy often follows the tone and the vision that decision makers and experts and leaders set. And so I think it's really incumbent upon decision makers and experts to put in the hard work to find ways to build a stable foundation for the U.S. China relationship. I think the reports like this one do that to try to push these policymaking communities to think about the possibilities that are out there. And my hope is that that'll put us on a better trajectory like the one that Dennis described, where we're at a more sort of stable place a decade later between the U.S. and China.
Well, I want to close by thanking all four of you for providing tremendous insights. I think this was an original and an important conversation. It really brought to the surface the importance of structured analytic thinking about the future, the risk of war, but the fact that all responsible thinkers should be doing everything possible to avoid the idea of two nuclear powers coming into direct conflict with each other. And importantly, the fact that the future of the United States relationship is not traveling a preset path. It is not locked into a linear trajectory. There are a range of trajectories available to it. And the choices that that leaders and publics in both countries make, but also external factors, will influence the trajectory of the relationship to come. So thank you very much for this rich conversation. We will be back in touch in a decade to see whether your predictions prove accurate or not. With that, thank you all and goodbye.